So we have Sandor here, and for people that aren't aware, he's pretty big in the fermentation community. Has three books. Wild Fermentation is the one probably best known for. The Art of Fermentation and The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved, which I think a lot of people here will agree with. So Sandor, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. And let me just also note that my original book, Wild Fermentation, has just been released in a revised and updated edition.
Excellent. Well, where can people get that?
Well, I mean, my website, Amazon, it's, they might not. I mean, I really just got my first copies about 2 weeks ago, so it may be that they haven't reached Australia yet. But I hope that they're on their way. I would expect that they're on their way, and that it'll be finding its way into Australian bookstores in the not too distant future.
So you've spoken a bit about bacteria being an ally. Bacteria also scares people and kills people, certain types. Can you explain what the fermentation process is? What's happening in those vegetables and meats when you cure them with salt or etc.?
Well, sure. I mean, broadly speaking, fermentation is the transformative action of microorganisms. Fermentation is practiced in every part of the world. It is just part of every culinary culture. Any food can be fermented, and what microbiology has enabled us to understand is that the reason why fermentation is practiced so universally is the simple fact that everything we eat, all of the plants and animal products that make up our food, are populated by elaborate communities of microorganisms, as are all forms of life. So, I mean, any of us who were raised in the 20th century were really raised in the context of what I describe as the war on bacteria, and this idea that bacteria are bad, and I think that the found and that bacteria are dangerous, and we need to defend ourselves against bacteria, and we have this whole chemical arsenal that we've designed specifically in order to destroy bacteria. Um, and I think that the origins of this, this mindset, the war on bacteria, is simply the fact that the earliest triumphs of microbiology in the earliest emergence of that field in the late 19th and early 20th centuries involved identifying pathogenic bacteria. And without denying the existence of some pathogenic bacteria, we actually have to recognize that bacteria is the most basic matrix of life. There's an emerging consensus in evolutionary biology that all life is descended from bacteria. And the corollary to this is that no form of life has ever lived without bacteria. So, every plant, every animal uh, uh, is in symbiosis with bacteria that are part of it. We're evolved from them and we live with them. So in our human bodies, we are host to something like 1 trillion bacteria. And these bacteria are not posing a danger to us. They're not parasitic. They're not even freeloaders. In fact, they give us our functionality. They enable us to effectively digest food and assimilate nutrients. They synthesize essential nutrients for us inside our bodies, so we don't have to find these nutrients in our food. What we call our immune system is mostly the work of bacteria in our bodies. And every day, every week, every month, we're learning sort of new information about the role of bacteria in our bodies, and we're learning that the regulation of our brain chemistry, serotonin, and other chemical compounds that determine how we feel and how we think are regulated by bacteria in our intestines in ways that we don't completely understand.
Mm.
The abilities of our liver cells to regenerate is regulated by bacteria in our intestines.
Mm.
Really every aspect of our well-being relates to these microorganisms that until recent times we thought of as our enemies that we needed to protect against. But guess what protects us against the small range of bacteria that can make us sick? it's the bacteria that are part of us. So, when we're continually assaulting the bacteria that are part of our bodies with, antibacterial cleansing products, antibiotic drugs, chlorinated water, all of this, chemical warfare, designed to diminish bacterial biodiversity, we actually are making ourselves more vulnerable to bacterial disease and not less vulnerable, because bacteria are our best defense against the limited range of bacteria that can make us sick. So all those soaps that advertise themselves on the basis of killing 99.9% of bacteria,
Mhm.
well, I mean, actually, 99.9% of bacteria are exactly what protect us from 0.1% of bacteria that have the potential to make us sick.
Especially if the soaps are leaving that 0.1%,
Yeah, yeah.
killing all the good stuff.
So I might have digressed, but I mean, fermentation is the transformative action of microorganisms. It's working, with the bacteria and fungi that are part of our food. It's used in many different applications. I mean, almost every individual in almost every part of the world eats and drinks products of fermentation every single day.
Mm.
So in a Western diet, that might start with a cup of coffee. Coffee is fermented. Um, Bread is fermented, or at least classically bread is fermented. A lot
Mm.
of modern supermarket bread actually bypasses the life process of fermentation. The
Mm.
cheese that we put on the bread is fermented. The cured meats are fermented. The olives, the sauerkraut, the kimchi, that we might have, with our sandwich are fermented. The condiments either are directly fermented, as in fish sauce, the mother of all condiments, and soy sauce, or
Mm.
else they rely on vinegar, which is a product of fermentation, in order to stabilize them, as in mustard, ketchup, mayonnaise, chutneys, salsas. Um, Chocolate is fermented, vanilla is fermented. Um, in many parts of the world, grains are routinely fermented.
Mm.
Um, Obviously, alcoholic beverages, beers and wines. There's a whole world of lightly fermented beverages along the lines of kombucha or ginger beer. Fermentation is practiced in lots of different ways. I mean,
Mm.
actually, the part of the world where people, for years were telling me there was no indigenous fermentation was Australia.
Mm.
And the first time I went to Australia, I went on a bush tucker with an Aboriginal guy, and the first thing he stopped to show us was a tree with nuts under it. I think it's called the bunya tree. And we pick up these nuts, and he says, "Don't eat them. They're poisonous. You have to soak them in water for a few days before they become safe to eat." Well, guess what happens when you soak a dry
Mm.
nut in water for a few days? You initiate a fermentation, and a
Mm.
detoxification like that is a really important application of fermentation that's used in many different parts of the world. So, I mean, there are different, benefits. There's always a practical benefit of fermentation.
Mm.
You're getting the desirable organisms to grow instead of organisms that could decompose the food. So you're either making the food safer to eat, or more delicious, or more easily digestible, or simply tastier, more nutritious, stable for long-term storage, which is particularly important in temperate environments with limited growing seasons. But
Mm.
there's always some sort of a practical benefit, instead of having the food decompose.
Mm. Absolutely. So, um, there are quite a few people in the audience that are going to be from sort of the health promotion sector, so helping people in the community, achieve better health outcomes. How does adding fermented foods, interact with people's health? How can it help improve health?
Well, I mean, in a number of different ways. I mean, first of all, I mean, fermentation can be thought of as a form of pre-digestion. So nutrients are broken down into simpler, more easily bioavailable forms by the process of fermentation.
Mm.
Maybe the most dramatic example of this would be soybeans. The reason why the vegetarian subcultures of the West adopted soybeans as a replacement for milk and meat is that soybeans are considered to be the most concentrated protein of any plant source food. The problem is, in a mature soybean, our human digestive systems cannot extract the protein out of the soybean. If you just cook soybeans until they're soft enough to eat and eat them, you'll just feel gassy and indigestion, and you won't be able to get the protein out of the soybeans. Our human digestive systems simply are not capable of that. So the Asian cultures that pioneered soy agriculture figured out that if they fermented the soybeans, as in soy sauce, as in miso, as in tempeh, as in natto, many other variations exist. But what actually happens is that during the fermentation, the proteins get broken down into amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. So that's pre-digestion. Minerals become much more bioavailable as a result of fermentation. There have been numerous studies that compared a pure yeast fermented bread with a bread made using a mixed culture fermentation, what we call a sourdough, natural leavening, that involves bacteria as well as yeast. And you always have significantly higher measurable levels of iron, calcium, and other minerals in the bacterially fermented bread than in the pure yeast fermented bread, because the bacteria basically break down these chemical bonds that would otherwise make the minerals inaccessible. The fermentation liberates the minerals and makes them accessible to us. Perhaps the most profound benefit of fermentation is found in a subset of fermented foods, what I would describe as live culture foods, foods that are not cooked after their fermentation. And in this case, you actually get the living bacteria, which, in the context of the war on bacteria and our, pretty much continual exposure to chemical compounds that can diminish biodiversity inside of us, eating bacteria-rich foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, kefir, drinking lightly fermented beverages, ingesting any of these bacteria-rich foods or beverages, can be thought of as probiotic therapy. I mean, you're essentially ingesting bacteria that can, help to promote greater diversity in the gut. Many people, including, the testimonial you just gave me, but I just hear over and over again, particularly from people who have, been living with chronic digestive problems, that when they begin incorporating foods like this, simply, having the bacteria from these foods in their intestines helps enable them to digest other food much more easily. There's also a lot of sort of demonstrated immune benefits of eating these kinds of bacteria-rich foods.
Yeah.
So
Correct.
in a nutshell, I would say that those are the main benefits. I mean, even the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization published a series of wonderful books about fermentation, 30 years ago, because they recognized that, in any kind of a food scarce environment, if you take whatever limited food resources you might have available to you and ferment them, you get more nutrition out of them. It's a strategy for optimizing the nutrients in whatever kind of food you might have available to eat. And I would say that in a local foods context, for sort of people in a given area trying to figure out how to meet more of their needs using what can be produced locally, fermentation is a really effective way of extending the season. Taking vegetables from your season of of abundance, using fermentation to preserve them, to have vegetables through the season of relative scarcity.
Yeah, no, they're great points. So on say some of those live culture fermented products, is there a difference between commercially fermented, what you find in the supermarket versus what you do at home?
Well, I mean, well, first of all, I just think it's important to point out that a lot of what you find in the supermarket doesn't have live cultures. I mean, all
Mm,
sauerkraut is fermented with bacteria, but if you're finding it in a can,
mm,
or in a jar that's not refrigerated at the supermarket, that has
mm,
been heat processed. So it
mm,
was fermented. It was alive at one point, and
mm,
then high heat was used to sort of stop the life process and make it shelf stable. So this is a very sort of modern approach. I mean, basically the idea of heat processing to stabilize to sterilize food in a jar is a 200-year-old idea. That process was invented in France in 1812. They call it appertisation because they remember the name of the clever Frenchman Nicolas Appert, who invented this process. Um, so yeah, I mean, when you eat those, I mean, they might be delicious, but they're not. They certainly don't have the live bacteria and this particular probiotic benefit.
mm,
I mean, there do exist products, and I mean, I've met people in Australia who are producing, small batch live fermented vegetables.
mm,
But generally, you're going to find these in a refrigerated section,
mm,
and not at the general supermarket, but at a more specialized store,
mm,
like a natural foods or health food kind of a store.
mm,
Um, and because it's has to be refrigerated in its transportation and its retailing, it generally is much more expensive.
mm,
Uh,
mm,
so there definitely are some good quality live products, but I think that there's a compelling case for making them yourself anyway, because the ultimate in sort of terroir and localism, is bacteria, which exist in nearly infinite variation. And if you're working with cabbages that are from your yard,
mm,
and working with them in your kitchen with your hands, you're going to just end up with a kind of unique bacterial signature in your sauerkraut.
mm,
Um, so I think that there's a compelling reason to do it yourself, but that good quality products are available, if you seek them out in the right kind of stores.
mm,
Um, it's easy to make it yourself. It's fun to make it yourself. It's totally safe. I mean, a lot of people project anxiety on the process of fermenting vegetables, and I have learned from working with a microbiologist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture that, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they can't find any case history anywhere in the world of food poisoning or illness from fermented vegetables.
wow.
This food is about as safe as it gets. I mean, we hear every year about cases of people getting sick from lettuce, spinach, tomatoes. Clearly it's possible to get sick from raw vegetables.
Mm,
Generally, the story is contamination from manure from a factory farm uphill, washing over the field of vegetables. But you know fermentation really is a safety strategy. So let's say we took vegetables that had been subjected to some contamination like that, chop them up, salted them, pound them, stuff them in a jar or a crock,
mm,
ferment them. The indigenous population of bacteria is always going to dominate over the incidental contaminants. And once you set up the environment that's so conducive to the growth of the lactic acid bacteria, like they will dominate, acidify the environment. And the brilliant thing about acidification as a strategy for food safety is, none of these organisms that we hear about people making people sick, E. coli 0157 or Salmonella, these just can't survive in an acidic environment. So,
mm.
so as the environment acidifies, even if there had been some incidental contamination to the raw vegetables, it dies off as the environment acidifies.
Right. And you obviously you've been fermenting for a long time. Um, you sort of ran through how to ferment vegetables just then for an absolute starter that that hasn't done it at home before. What is that process? Break down that process a little bit more.
Okay.
Starting with
Okay.
you grab the cabbage from the garden, you bring it into the kitchen.
Well, I should say cabbage is not the only
No,
vegetable you
no,
can
of
do this.
course, of
You can
course.
do this with almost any vegetable.
Yeah.
I mean, really, with any vegetable. you know, different vegetables will have different flavor and texture character, which you might like more or less. I mean, cabbage is has a really nice kind of neutral flavor,
Mm.
which just gets better and better as you ferment it. But you can use almost any kind of vegetable. All root vegetables ferment beautifully. Any of the cousins of cabbages, kohlrabis, ferment beautifully. Turnips ferment beautifully.
Mm.
Um, you can also use like string beans, okra, green tomatoes.
Mm.
It just depends what you have and what season you're in. But you take any vegetables. Your main objective when you want to ferment them is to get them submerged. If you leave them exposed to air, typically what will grow are molds. And
Mhm.
so the strategy is if you get the vegetables submerged, then you're protecting them from the oxygen which the molds need. And what will flourish in this protected environment are lactic acid bacteria. There's no need to add bacteria. The bacteria are on all vegetables, really on all plants. It is thought that all plants growing out of soil on planet Earth have lactic acid bacteria as part of them.
Mm.
Um, Generally, you salt the vegetables. The salt is not absolutely essential. It is possible to make sauerkraut without any salt, but it's much better with salt. The flavor is better. The texture is better. It'll ferment much more slowly and for a much longer time. But it doesn't require a lot of salt. Like, anybody who comes from, an Eastern or Central European family where this has been in the lineage continuously, thinks of sauerkraut as a very salty food. And if these were the only vegetables that you were going to be seeing for the next 6 months, you have an incentive to put a lot of salt in. But
Mm.
if you're making this, not for survival through a long, harsh winter, but rather for something that's going to taste good and be supportive of your good health, there's no reason to use a lot of salt.
Right.
There's a good reason to use a little bit of salt because you'll get a better texture and a better flavor,
Mm.
and a slower fermentation process. But the salt is not absolutely necessary. So in the dry salting method, which is the sauerkraut method, the simplest, most straightforward way, you chop up or grate your vegetables. You're trying to create surface area.
Mm.
And the importance of surface area is that you're trying to pull juice out of the vegetables. Rather than adding water, which would dilute the flavor, you're just trying to get the vegetables submerged under their own juices. The salt starts that process through osmosis, pulling juice out of the vegetables. And then we can enhance that by pounding, or on a small scale, I just like to squeeze the vegetables. Um, and then, after you squeeze them for 5 minutes, you notice they're juicy. And when you squeeze a
Mm.
handful, it's like a sponge and juice drips out. Once they're juicy enough like that, then you just fill your vessel. And you could use a little, like a little jar. You can use a ceramic crock. You can use a wooden barrel. You
Mm.
can use a plastic bucket. You want to stay away from metal because both salt and the acids that are going to be created can corrode metal.
Mm.
But glass, glazed ceramic, wood or plastic all work great as vessels. But I think the most straightforward thing, especially for initial experimentation at home, would be a jar.
Mm.
You can just reuse a jar that you bought some prepared food at the supermarket in. Um, a liter jar will take about a kilo of vegetables. You can mix different vegetables together. And that's the whole process. And you can leave it for 3 days, or you can leave it for 3 weeks, or if you have a cool spot, you can leave it for 3 months. It will continue to get more acidic up to a point as it progresses. What I recommend that people do is taste it. Give it 3 days, taste a little bit, pack it back down, give it a few more days, pack it
Mm.
back down. And then you get to, kind of experience the evolving flavors.
Mm.
The acids accumulate over time. It'll become more acidic, tangier, tartar. Um, and if at any point you taste it and you think, wow, this has gone far enough, I'm not sure I want this to get any stronger, well, chances are you have a fermentation slowing device in your kitchen. And you just put it in the refrigerator, and that just slows it down to an imperceptible rate.
Mm.
If you were somebody who is living without refrigeration. You don't need a refrigerator for this food, for the thousands of years that people have been making it. Most of them have not had a refrigerator. That's just a possibility if you want to, sort of keep the flavor mild and preserve it for a longer period of time.
Mm.
But that's the basics of how you make sauerkraut. Then, there's other variations. If you want to leave vegetables whole or in big chunks, then you need to mix up a brine solution and you ferment the vegetables under the brine solution.
Mm.
You can season in any way that you like. You can just keep it plain with just salt, or you can add, garlic, onions, ginger, dill, caraway, juniper berries. Make it like kimchi with chili peppers and ginger and garlic and shallots. Or you can be inventive and make a curry kraut or, sort of some other, experimental flavoring. You can incorporate cooked elements. I sometimes make a mashed potato sauerkraut that I heard about from a woman whose grandmother was from a town in Poland where everybody bulked up their sauerkraut with mashed potatoes. You can incorporate, seaweed, sprouts, fish sauce. I mean, it's really, once you start playing around with it, it's pretty much infinite. I actually I have with me. I have just gotten home a few days ago from several weeks of traveling, but a friend came over. It's high summer here. And a friend came over with a watermelon that she had grown, and we ate the watermelon. But I cut up the watermelon rind, and I'm pickling those under a brine. So this is just a saltwater solution with a few cloves of garlic and some dill, and I just chopped up the watermelon rind. Beautiful fresh organic watermelon, and I'm fermenting it, and it'll really taste just like fermented cucumbers. It'll just be like a pickle.
Right. Wow. So that I guess I'm interested. What would be the strangest or most interesting thing that you fermented?
Well, I mean, once you realize that
Anything? Yeah.
any food can be fermented, I mean,
It's all normal.
I could say that some of the things I've tried that had the most extreme flavors were fermented fish, like the Swedish fermented fish called surströmming.
Mm.
But the idea of fermenting fish doesn't seem so strange to me, and actually the flavor from the 4 or 5 times that I've tried surströmming has certainly grown on me. I would say that in general, like fermentation creates these compelling flavors. The people who learn to love the flavors of fermentation are passionate about them, but they're not necessarily flavors like sweet is a flavor that we're just born loving. The flavors of fermentation, for the most part, are things that I would describe as acquired tastes. And some of the flavors of fermentation are kind of edgy. So, like, when you take certain fish fermentations, whether we're talking about, fish sauce that you might find in contemporary Southeast Asian cuisines, or the surströmming from Sweden that I'm talking about. The breakdown of proteins in fermentation is not altogether different from the breakdown of proteins in decomposition. And so I think some of the aversion to some of the stronger flavors and aromas of fermentation, is this sort of aversion that we have to decomposition. And so, we have to learn to overcome that, but through exposure. I think cheese offers a beautiful, vivid illustration of this, because I mean, I would imagine most people in your audience in Australia, eat cheese. So, they're familiar with, probably most people like cheddar cheese, something that's, a little bit more mild. But once you start getting into the really stinky cheeses, the gorgonzolas, the extremely ripe bries,
Yeah.
it's a narrower segment of the population who finds that pleasurable at all.
Mm.
And once in a while, I'll invest in a chunk of really stinky ripe cheese and invite some friends over to share it with me. And inevitably, someone will walk in the door and smell it in the other room and make a face and say, "Did something die in your house?" And like they would just never ever think about putting something like that in their mouths. And
Mm.
I mean, as a kid, I never thought about eating those stinky cheeses. They just grossed me out.
Mm.
But at some point, I got more adventurous and started tasting them, and now I just have this like passion for these, really really strong stinky cheeses.
Mm.
And I think around the world, there's a lot of examples of that, of these sort of foods that are just sort of normal, delicious to the people who are used to them. And, to most people from the outside, they just seem, like disgusting, rotten food.
Yeah.
And, science does not offer us like a sort of like a hard and clear dividing line between like food that is fermented to perfection and food that is rotten.
Mm.
And I think that there is a large part of that that is subjective and culturally determined.
Mm. Mm. Where do you go from there?
Uh, so I would say like sauerkraut could fall in the same category. Like
Yeah.
not everybody loves sauerkraut,
Yeah.
and I have people who tell me like, oh, I wish I could get my kids to eat sauerkraut, but they think it's disgusting. Well,
Yeah.
if the first time a child ever experiences the smell and flavor of sauerkraut is when they're 7 or 8 years old,
Mm.
yeah, they're not going to accept it. But if as your kid is teething and first eating solid food, if they see you eating that, they'll want
Mm.
to taste it. If they start tasting it, then they're going to always love it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is just when we expose people to these foods.
Mm.
Like later childhood is a harder time to introduce new edgy flavors.
Yeah.
Early on, kids are much more receptive. Later on, they'll probably become more receptive.
Mm.
But you know, it, we need to introduce these foods, I would say, early if we want to get our kids eating them. And a lot
Yeah.
of people are trying to get their kids eating them, just because. Problems with gut bacteria have been linked to sort of so many different issues,
Mm.
from allergies to autism.
Mm.
There's a lot of people trying to get their kids to eat fermented foods, but I would say like we have to incorporate them into our own, lives and meals and introduce them to our babies before we
Mm.
can, effectively introduce them to our, 7, 8, and 9-year-olds.
And the interest in these foods has been growing for the last 10 years, obviously, probably longer than that, but you've noticed a large growth in interest.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's a huge growth in interest, and I mean, I would say that the major products of fermentation have always been popular. I mean, beer, cheese,
Yeah.
wine, bread, olives, salamis,
Mm.
vinegar. I mean, these foods just never were not popular.
They're not even identified as something that is fermented. They're just foods in most
But
people's minds. Yep.
I would say that. I would say that the rise in interest in fermentation is related to sort of two broad trends. I mean, one is just a broader interest in food.
Mm.
After a couple of generations of a full embrace of convenience and people being thrilled to not have to work so hard for their food. To be able to go to
Mm.
one store, buy things that are processed or partially processed. Was really seen as liberation for
Mm.
some decades, and then at some point, things started to switch, and people
Mm.
started recognizing that actually, okay, when we eat all of this processed food from the supermarket, the food is nutritionally diminished, and we're actually not being as well fed, and we're seeing all
Mm.
of these new kinds of health epidemics
Mm.
on the rise, probably related to the quality of the food that we're eating. And we're seeing that the processes by which food can be mass produced, and one person can produce enough food for 100 people, are environmentally destructive. And removing food production from our communities is economically devastating. And so, I kind of think for all these reasons, people started just interrogating their food more. Not
Mm.
everybody, but many people started asking questions about their food. Where does it come from? How is it produced? What are the ingredients in this processed food? And once you start interrogating your food like that, fermentation is just part of the answer because fermentation is so widespread. Once you start asking questions about how your food is produced, fermentation, inevitably is part of the answer. And then the other side of this is that after a century of thinking of bacteria simply as something bad,
Mm.
that we need to avoid, that we need to kill when we encounter it, people started recognizing that the story is more complex than that, and that we actually are quite dependent on bacteria for our health and well-being. And people started getting interested in probiotics and other kinds of strategies for increasing biodiversity in the gut in order to improve digestion, in order to improve immune function,
Mm.
and so people started being interested in eating bacteria, and one way to do it is popping pills, probiotics. But
Mm.
a more effective way, a more traditional way of doing this is by eating traditional fermented foods that are bacteria rich.
Yeah.
Um, so I think sort of both of these streams have come together, and then also the local food movement. And in most places, if you're thinking about like how can we effectively sort of feed people based on what we can grow in our immediate region, then you have to start thinking more about different methods of preservation, and fermentation is really the classic method of preservation, and also from the standpoint of uh, farmer well-being, like all of
Mm.
the major value-added products, the ways that farmers can take the raw products of agriculture and convert them into products that are, more stable and more valuable.
Mm.
Fermentation is really the basis of most of the classic value-added products. You take your cabbage and turn it into sauerkraut, you have something more stable and more valuable. You take your
Mm.
grapes and turn them into wine, you have something
Mm.
that's more stable and more valuable. You take your milk and turn it into cheese, you have something that's more stable and more valuable. So, so I think from a lot of different perspectives, fermentation, people are recognizing that fermentation is really important, and even from a culinary standpoint. So, you get sort of chefs who are interested in um, manipulating flavor and
Mm.
creating memorable flavors and creating unique signature flavors. Fermentation is a great way for a chef to do that. So you have people getting interested from all these different practical standpoints. Food preservation, like local food, improved nutrition, probiotics for better health, as well as just sort of like the gourmet quest for compelling flavor.
So this is actually a really interesting area for us because a lot of the people in the audience are from the local government sector. Um, we've heard stories both last year and this year from a number of small businesses that have wanted to cure their own meats or make their own cheese, and they've had the Victorian Authority actually come in and shut them down, and not for doing anything necessarily dangerous, but for not meeting the local regulations as they stand. So, for somebody, there might be someone in the audience that actually has the power to work on this and change it. Um, you know, do you have any advice for those people on how to take those steps?
Well, I mean, I think it's just really important for us to recognize that these traditional fermented foods have a long track record of safety. And so I mean, our contemporary like dogma of food safety is anything is suspect if it has sat outside of refrigeration or between, let's see, in Fahrenheit, we'd say between 40 and 140 degrees, and in Celsius, that would maybe be from like,
5 to 60 is,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
So that's considered the danger zone. Anything that's
Mm.
sat in that range for more than 4 hours is immediately suspect. Well, every single fermented food and beverage sits for more than 4 hours in that temperature range. So if you want to make yogurt, it's going to sit for at least 4 hours. At 110, so that would be like around 42 or 43
Mm.
degrees. If you want to make salami, it has to hang for a few days at a really warm temperature before going into an earth temperature chamber for its longer curing. But even the earth temperature chamber is, sort of well above, refrigeration
Mm.
kind of temperature. So, I mean, I think we just have to recognize that, um, this blanket rule is doesn't tell the whole story. There are all kinds of foods. I mean, just to sort of tell a little anecdote that happened here where I live in Tennessee. So a friend of mine is a farmer and has some cows and decided to start making cheese and got interested in some sort of classic raw milk cheese making. And it turned out that he was the first person in the state of Tennessee to propose making a raw milk cheese. And basically, the state said, we don't even think conceptually that it's possible for you to do this safely.
Mm.
He had to go to the store with them. He had to take them to the cheese store in Chattanooga and say, like, look, this is a raw milk cheese that's coming from France. Look, this is a raw milk cheese that's from Wisconsin. This is a raw milk cheese that's from California. Do you just think in Tennessee we're not smart enough to do this? Like, you're
Mm.
letting these products that are made in other places be sold here.
Mm.
Like why can't we make this here with the products of our own local agriculture? And I
Mm.
think that whether you're talking about fermented vegetables or cheeses or salamis or kombucha, these products are out there in the on in the market, and
Mm.
we have to sort of find. I mean, it's not that we don't. I mean, they need to be regulated like any kind of a food business. I mean,
Mm.
people can produce these things in ways that are rigorous and clean and minimize the risks, or they can be made in ways that that aren't. So we have to find sort of flexible ways for food regulatory authorities to regulate these kinds of businesses, recognizing that these processes are safe, that they have long track records of safety, and we
Mm.
have to find reasonable ways to regulate them. And what I hear over and over again from people starting fermentation businesses is that they end up becoming educators for the people who are regulating them.
Mm.
Because often the regulators just know the dogma that they've been told about food in general,
Mm.
and the fermented foods, are just a little bit different than that.
Yeah.
And then I would also just add for restaurant inspectors that
Mm.
it, there have to be allowances for chefs in restaurants to be fermenting also. And it's really unbelievable to me how many sort of chefs at prominent restaurants I visited around the world tell me the same story, that like they have to hide their the vinegar that they're making,
Mm.
or the yogurt they're making, or the cordial that they're fermenting, from their inspectors.
Mm.
And I would rather see the inspectors begin to recognize that this is a very legitimate and important aspect of food production, that we have to figure out rational ways to regulate.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we probably could have covered this a little bit earlier as well, but what's the environmental impact of this? We're told that to feed the world, we need chemicals and diesel, and we need to genetically modify everything, and otherwise, everyone's going to starve. But, is this a solution? I mean, it's a very local solution. You can do it at home. You don't need very high-tech stuff.
Well, I mean, personally, I mean, I'm very skeptical of these claims that we need intensifying biotechnology in order to feed people. I mean, really, if our objective is maximizing the amount of food that we produce on a given piece of land, we should throw away our tractors. Just large-scale tractor agriculture, sort of never can produce as much as more labor-intensive methods. Our limitation, on a global scale, definitely is not labor; it's land. So, if we're really serious about, figuring out how to maximize food production, it's really, returning to more labor-intensive methods, polycultures rather than monocultures. But that's not really the objective. The objective is, sort of for large-scale agriculture. And large-scale agriculture, and larger scales have been possible through intensifying biotechnology. But it's not really about maximizing production per acre. It's about maximizing production per person hour. And those are very different kinds of things. And if we're really talking about feeding the world, then we're talking about a different kind of a style of agriculture. But fermentation definitely can fit into that. I mean, there's all kinds of things that might be looked on as inedible. Like, okay, for instance, amaranth stalks. Like, people eat the seed of the amaranth, people eat the leaves of the amaranth. Generally, the stalk is discarded. The stalk is a beautiful thing to ferment. You can make beautiful pickles out of amaranth stalks. Right. I think that there are a lot of innovative ways that people can use fermentation to derive some sort of benefit from things thought of as agricultural byproducts.
And I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. How did you actually get started in it?
Well, I mean, interestingly, my previous life was actually in municipal government in New York City.
Right.
And I was working in municipal government in New York City in the early 90s. And I mean, basically I was sort of like, I was ready for a big change in my life. I randomly met some people who lived at this rural community off the grid in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee. I was very intrigued by them. I went and I visited. I was very enchanted by what I saw. And within a year, I had left my job, left my apartment in New York, and moved to this community in Tennessee where I got very involved in gardening and cooking for people. And the first season that I was gardening, I mean, I was such a naive city kid that I never even thought about the idea that, in a garden, all of the cabbage would be ready at the same time. So that first year that I was gardening, and we had, I mean, it wasn't a field of cabbage. It was, a row of, maybe 20 heads of cabbage. But, it occurred to me like, oh, I better learn how to make sauerkraut. I already knew I loved to eat sauerkraut, but I had just never made it. And so it was easy to find a recipe, and I made my first batch of sauerkraut. And I mean, I've really been just fermenting vegetables pretty much continually since then. And then I also started playing around with making yogurt, making what we call country wines, like elderberry wine or blackberry wine. Started playing around with cheese making. I started a sourdough and started learning how to bake bread and make pancakes with a sourdough starter. And then I started doing some research, and I learned how to make tempeh and miso and started making those things, and just started, investigating fermentation traditions in different parts of the world. And, because I was living in a community and didn't have a full-time job, and my work really involved feeding the community, I really was pretty free to kind of indulge this obsession as it developed, and it was mostly a personal obsession that I shared with my friends and fellow communards for most of the first decade. But then I got invited to teach a sauerkraut making workshop, and that led me into writing and self-publishing a little zine, and then that led me into writing my book Wild Fermentation, and that led me into more teaching. And really, I mean, my learning curve is ongoing. I mean, it turns out that fermentation is just kind of an infinite realm of human activity. Sometimes I still feel like I've only barely scratched the surface, and that there's so much still to learn about. I mean, it's just practiced in so much interesting variation, and just so many people. I mean, just particularly immigrants who I meet from different parts of the world have such interesting stories to share.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the top of the video that you've got the wild fermentations being re-released. Do you have any other things in the works? If you're just scratching the surface, obviously there'd be a lot to write about and work on going forward.
Well, I mean, so Wild Fermentation's just been re-released. I mean, because my learning curve has been ongoing, and I keep learning more, and also because I'm much more experienced as an educator teaching people about fermentation. I kept on correcting my book. So at some point, I decided I better do a better job of it, so I don't have to keep correcting myself. Well, the big project that I'm excited about right now is that I am going in November and December to China. So I have a Chinese, the mother of a friend of mine, who is going to sort of bring me to small villages where she knows people, and we're going to learn about food preservation in rural Western China. So that's something that I'm really interested in. I mean, anyone who's sort of paying attention to food culture, knows about some of the Korean traditions of fermentation. There's a lot. Kimchi is pretty globally available. Gochujang. There's a lot written in English about the Korean fermentation traditions. Similarly, Japanese fermentation traditions. Miso is available, pretty widespread. Some of the Japanese styles of pickles, and there's a lot written in English. But even though, like, China has probably the most elaborate fermentation traditions, some of the most ancient fermentation traditions, there's very little information in the English language. So I'm excited to learn more about that.
That sounds like that'll be an interesting trip and an interesting project. So, look, thank you for spending a bit of time with us, and we really appreciate it. It's been incredibly informative. And yeah, if people want to find your book or find out more about you, best website is
wildfermentation.com.
Great, easy, great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. So great to be part of this conference.
Thank you.
Without having to be on 2 long flights.
Yeah.